A corpse slumping over the mahogany table in the middle of a billion-dollar cartel negotiation was an absolute death sentence for business. With only seconds to salvage his crumbling empire, Lorenzo Moretti's desperate salvation arrived in the most unlikely form, a delivery worker hauling 80 pounds of pastrami sandwiches through the door. The penthouse suite of the Grand Continental in Manhattan smelled intensely of copper-expensive Tom Ford cologne and gun oil. Lorenzo Moretti, the undisputed head of the Moretti crime syndicate, stood perfectly still, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate, though his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. At his feet, his chief translator and closest confidant, CEO, was choking on his own frothing saliva, the victim of a fast-acting neurotoxin slipped into his espresso. Lorenzo didn't look at his dying friend. He couldn't afford to. Seated around the massive custom-built mahogany table were three of the most dangerous men on the planet, none of whom spoke more than a few words of English. To Lorenzo's left sat Grigory Yudin, a notoriously brutal Russian oligarch whose shipping lanes through the Baltic Sea were essential. To his right was Wei Chen, a high-ranking lieutenant of a Macau triad who controlled the West Coast ports, and directly across from him, lazily spinning a gold-plated lighter, was Hector Salazar, a volatile cartel boss from Sinaloa. This meeting was supposed to finalize a three-way, multi-billion-dollar distribution network for untraceable weaponry and narcotics. Without CIO, the fragile alliance was crumbling before it even began. Paranoia was a disease in this room, and silence was its primary symptom. Grigory slammed a meaty fist on the table, his face turning an angry shade of violet as he barked a rapid, aggressive string of Russian. Wei Chen immediately stood up, his hand hovering over the suppressed pistol tucked into his waistband, shouting back in harsh Mandarin. Hector chuckled darkly, murmuring a threat in rapid-fire regional Spanish that Lorenzo barely caught, but the click of a safety being disengaged was a universal language. Lorenzo raised his hands, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "Gentlemen, please. Un momento. Please." They ignored him. The tension in the room was a taut wire, seconds away from snapping into a bloodbath that would plunge 3 continents into an underworld war. Then the heavy oak doors of the penthouse burst open. Every gun in the room, a dozen heavy-caliber weapons wielded by the bosses and their shadow-like bodyguards, swiveled instantly toward the doorway. Standing there was Beatrice Gallagher. B was 32, severely underpaid, and undeniably unapologetically fat. At 320 pounds, she filled the doorway, her wide, soft hips straining against the cheap maroon polyester uniform pants of Goldberg's premium catering. Sweat beaded on her forehead and plastered her dark hair to her cheeks. She was panting heavily, having carried 2 massive insulated bags filled with 80 pounds of hot pastrami potato salad and garlic pickles, because the service elevator had stalled on the 40th floor. She froze. Her wide brown eyes darted from the bleeding man on the floor to the custom-tailored monsters around the table, to the dozen hollow-point barrels pointed directly at her chest. Grigory, furious at the interruption, waved his gun at her and screamed a vicious Russian insult, ordering his men to shoot the intruder and be done with it. Wei Chen sneered, adding a cutting remark in Mandarin about the Americans' lack of security, and the sheer size of the woman calling her a clumsy elephant that had blundered into a dragon's den. Hector laughed out loud, tossing out a filthy Spanish comment about what he'd do to a woman with thighs that thick if he weren't so busy. Lorenzo closed his eyes, bracing for the gunfire. Instead, he heard a heavy sigh. It was a sigh of profound, exhaustion-fueled annoyance. B let the catering bags drop to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of a plump, dimpled hand, planted her thick legs shoulder-width apart, and looked dead at the Russian oligarch. Ja by predpochel vine направляли на меня эту вещь, если только не собираетесь оплатить, шет заеду перед тем, как убить меня. Bia snapped in flawless, unaccented Moscow dialect Russian. I'd prefer you not point that thing at me, unless you plan on paying the catering bill before you kill me. Grigory's jaw dropped. The gun wavered. Before the room could recover from the shock, Bea shifted her furious gaze to Wei Chen. Her voice changed the tonal inflection, shifting instantly into perfect crisp Mandarin. Wobushi da zong, dan wojide zidaoni, gangchai de chengwe yu duo wuli. Bakyang fangxia fuze, nijantian de wukan hui hen nangkan. I am not an elephant, but I know exactly how rude your insult was. Put the gun down, or your lunch today is going to get very ugly. Wei Chen stepped back, blinking rapidly, his sophisticated veneer shattering. Finally she glared at Hector Salazar, who was staring at her as if she were an alien. Y en cuanto a ti pendejo, she spat in raw colloquial Mexican Spanish. Si me tocas un solo pelo, te haré tragar esta mostaza picante por la nariz. Entendido? And as for you, asshole, if you touch a single hair on my head, I'll make you swallow this spicy mustard through your nose. Understood. Silence descended upon the penthouse. It was absolute and profound. Lorenzo Moretti stared at the sweaty, heavily panting, profoundly overweight delivery woman as if she were an angel sent directly from God. She was breathing hard, her large chest heaving, her thick arms crossing defensively over her stomach. She looked terrified, but a stubborn fire burned in her eyes. You, Lorenzo whispered, his voice hoarse. You speak their languages. Bea looked at the breathtakingly handsome Italian mafia boss. I have a master's degree in applied linguistics and advanced interpretation from Georgetown, she said, her voice trembling slightly, now that the adrenaline was wearing off. But academia doesn't pay the rent, and a severe anxiety disorder makes traditional corporate work difficult. So I deliver sandwiches. The total comes to $642. Can I please just get a signature? Lorenzo stepped over the lifeless body of his former translator, walked directly to Bea, and gently, almost reverently, took the clipboard from her shaking soft hands. Beatrice, Lorenzo said, reading her name tag. He looked deeply into her panicked brown eyes. I'm going to give you exactly $2 million. Bea blinked. What? $2 million? In cash wire transfer, whatever you want. On one condition. He gestured toward the empty chair next to his at the head of the blood-splattered table. You sit down, you eat a pastrami sandwich, and you translate the rest of this meeting for me. Because if you don't, we are all going to die in this room. Bea found herself wedged into a sleek, minimalist Italian leather chair that was designed for supermodels, not a woman of her significant carriage. The armrests dug painfully into her wide thighs, but the physical discomfort was a distant background noise compared to the sheer terror vibrating through her nervous system. The body of the poisoned translator had been unceremoniously dragged into a coat closet. The 80 pounds of deli food was unpacked. The surreal image of Grigory Yudin aggressively chewing a garlic pickle while adjusting the slide of his Glock 19 was burned into Bea's retinas forever. Tell the Russian, Lorenzo said, his voice, a low, soothing baritone right next to her ear, that the Maersk shipping containers leaving the port of Newark will bypass standard customs via our inside men at Terminal 4. But I need his men to handle the offloading in St. Petersburg. Bea took a deep, shuddering breath. Her large, soft hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table. She turned to Grigory and relayed the message in rapid, flawless Russian, ensuring she used the specific underworld jargon for inside men, izvoy люди, to establish street credibility. Grigori listened, his cold blue eyes locked onto Bea. He replied, speaking quickly and aggressively. B turned to Lorenzo. He says that is acceptable, but he demands a 45% cut of the gross revenue from the Baltic route, not the 35% you discussed earlier. She paused, lowering her voice so only Lorenzo could hear. But Mr. Moretti, the specific phrasing he used an idiom, pust, volk, siestovcu. Let the wolf eat the sheep. In this context, in the Moscow syndicate, it's not a negotiation tactic. It's a delay tactic. He's agreeing to the terms because he doesn't intend to honor them. I think he plans to ambush your shipment in St. Petersburg and take 100%. Lorenzo's dark eyes widened a fraction of an inch. A thrill went down his spine. His old translator CO was adequate, but he merely translated words. This woman, this brilliantly sharp, terrified woman with her chafing thighs and faded polo shirt, was translating intent. She was reading the cultural subtext. Fascinating, Lorenzo murmured, his gaze lingering on the curve of her jaw, flushed pink with anxiety. Tell Hector that if he can guarantee the Sinaloa supply lines to the East Coast, I will handle the Russian problem myself. Bee's heart hammered as she switched to Spanish, maintaining the delicate balance of respect and threat required for cartel negotiations. The meeting stretched for 3 agonizing hours. Bey was a maestro, conducting a symphony of criminal diplomacy. She smoothed over Wei Chen's bruised ego with delicate Mandarin honorifics, diffused Hector's explosive temper, with culturally specific jokes that Lorenzo couldn't have even conceptualized, and navigated Grigori's treacherous demands. She was exhausted. Her back ached, her uniform was soaked in sweat, and she desperately wanted to go back to her tiny, lonely apartment in Queens and binge-watch baking shows. Finally, the terms were set. Blood oaths were sworn. The 3 international bosses stood offering Lorenzo begrudging nods of respect, their eyes lingering on the fat delivery woman who had somehow brokered the most lucrative black market deal of the decade. As Grigori passed Bea, he leaned down, his massive frame towering over her. "Ty slishkom umna dla togo, shtobi raznosit jedu devochka," he rumbled in Russian. "You are too smart to carry food, little girl. Kogda on tebe naskočit pridikomne. Ja stelaju tebia korolevoj. When you bore of him, come to me. I will make you a queen." Bea didn't flinch. "Ja predpočitaju svoju nezavisimost I u vas iz rta pachnet marinadom," she replied smoothly. "I prefer my independence, and your breath smells like pickle brine." Grigori threw his head back and roared with laughter, slapping Lorenzo on the shoulder before exiting with his entourage. Once the massive oak doors clicked shut, leaving only Lorenzo Bey and Lorenzo's heavily armed guards in the penthouse, Bey let out a massive, shuddering breath. Her whole body seemed to deflate. She struggled to push herself up from the chair, the leather squeaking against her thighs. "Well," Bey said, her voice shaking slightly. "That's done. I'll take that wire transfer now, Mr. Moretti. I can write down my routing number." Lorenzo poured 2 glasses of 20-year-old Macallan Scotch. He walked over, handing one to Bea. She took it hesitantly, her large fingers brushing against his. He noticed the stark contrast, his hands calloused from violence, hers soft and plump. "Drink," he commanded softly. She took a sip, coughing slightly at the burn. "You saved my empire today, Beatrice," Lorenzo said, pacing slowly around her. He moved like a panther, silent and predatory. "More importantly, you saved my life. If Grigori had ambushed my men in St. Petersburg, I would have been weakened. Wei Chen would have smelled the blood in the water. I would be dead by Christmas." "You're welcome," Bea said, clutching her cheap catering bag. "I really just want to go home now." Lorenzo stopped in front of her. He looked at her plain face, devoid of makeup, her heavy, exhausted frame, and the brilliant, calculating mind hidden behind her terrified eyes. "You can't go home, Beatrice," Lorenzo said quietly. Bea froze. The blood drained from her face. You promised. You said if I translated, you'd pay me. You're going to kill me because I know too much." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her thick cheeks. "Please. I live alone. I don't have anyone to tell. I'll disappear. Shoka." "Kill you?" Lorenzo looked genuinely offended. He stepped closer, reaching out to gently wipe a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch sent a violent jolt of electricity through Bea's spine. "Beatrice, you are the most valuable asset I have ever encountered. Grigory just offered to make you his queen. Do you think he's going to let you go back to delivering pastrami? Do you think Wei Chen won't send his triad ghosts to kidnap you and use you against me?" Bea stared at him, the horrifying reality of the underworld sinking in. By sitting at that table, she hadn't just saved Lorenzo. She had made herself a high-value piece on a global chessboard. "You don't deliver sandwiches anymore, Beatrice," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a dark, possessive timbre. "You belong to the Moretti family now. You belong to me. I am going to put you in a penthouse. I am going to buy you a wardrobe that doesn't bruise your skin. And you are going to be my voice." Bea gripped the handles of her empty delivery bags, her knuckles turning white. "And if I refuse," Lorenzo leaned in his lips, brushing the shell of her ear, the scent of gunpowder and cologne enveloping her senses. "Then I will have to convince you. And Beatrice, I am a very convincing man." The golden cage Lorenzo Moretti built for Beatrice Gallagher was located on the 42nd floor of a hyper-exclusive glass tower in Tribeca. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows, a private chef who previously held 2 Michelin stars at Le Bernardin, and a security detail composed of heavily armed men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast. For the first week, Bea was paralyzed by a bizarre cocktail of terror imposter syndrome and the sudden jarring absence of financial panic. Her bank account now showed a daily direct deposit that exceeded her previous annual salary. But she was a prisoner, albeit one wrapped in $1,000 cashmere throws. On her 8th day in captivity, the massive mahogany double doors to the penthouse opened. Lorenzo strode in, flanked by 3 nervous-looking women carrying garment bags. He looked devastatingly sharp in a midnight blue Tom Ford suit, a silver Patek Philippe watch glinting on his wrist. "You have been wearing the same oversized university sweatpants for 4 days, Beatrice Orcusat." Lorenzo said, his tone conversational, but laced with absolute authority. "While I admire the Georgetown pride, my chief intelligence officer cannot look like she's cramming for midterms." Bea bristled, pulling the heavy fabric of her hoodie tighter over her large stomach. "Off-the-rack Italian designer clothes don't exactly cater to a size 24, Mr. Moretti. I don't fit into the mafia wife aesthetic of silk slip dresses and stilettos. I'm fat. I'm clumsy. I like comfortable waistbands." Lorenzo didn't flinch. He simply gestured to the women. "Which is why I didn't send you to Bergdorf Goodman. I brought the head tailor from Christian Siriano's private atelier, along with a team who understands that true power requires custom architecture." He stepped closer, his dark eyes dropping to take in her wide hips and the soft, thick curve of her thighs. There was no disgust in his gaze, only a heavy, simmering heat that made Bea's breath catch in her throat. "Do not ever apologize for the space you take up, Beatrice. The women in my world are starving ghosts. You are substantial. You are real. Now let them measure you. We have a dinner meeting with the Irish at 8. The transformation was startling. By the time they arrived at the back room of a private, dimly lit speakeasy in Hell's Kitchen, Bey was poured into a custom-tailored, deep emerald green wrap dress. The heavy jersey fabric draped flawlessly over her large breasts, cinched tightly at her waist, and flowed elegantly over her stomach and hips. She looked powerful. She felt terrifying. The meeting was with Arthur Gallagher, no relation to Bea, a notoriously stubborn boss of the West Side Irish mob. Lorenzo needed Arthur's union contacts to move construction materials for a money-laundering front. Arthur, a red-faced man with a thick brogue, spent the first hour drinking heavily and speaking in a thick, coded Dublin street slang, intentionally trying to box Lorenzo out of the negotiation. Lorenzo sat back, sipping his bourbon, and simply tapped the table twice. It was their signal. Bea leaned forward. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her linguistic training took over. She didn't just translate, she mirrored the cadence and cultural aggression of the speaker. "Arthur," Bea said, her voice dropping into a flawless, working-class North Side Dublin accent that she had perfected during her master's thesis. "Stop acting the maggot and playing the hard man. Lorenzo knows your boys on the docks are skimming off the top of the union dues. We can either bury that little secret and do business, or I can translate your ledger for the federal prosecutors." "What's it going to be?" Arthur choked on his Guinness. The blood drained from his florid face. He stared at the large, commanding woman in the emerald dress as if she were a witch. 10 minutes later, the deal was signed. In the armored Maybach on the way home, Lorenzo poured them both a glass of champagne. The neon lights of Times Square washed over the car's interior, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw. "You are a terrifying creature, Beatrice," Lorenzo murmured, his voice thick with admiration. "I'm just a linguist with a very good memory," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly from the leftover adrenaline. Lorenzo reached across the leather seat. His large, warm hand enveloped hers, his thumb tracing the soft, plump flesh of her knuckles. "No, you are the key to the city." He pulled her hand to his lips, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to her skin. "And someone is trying to take the city from me." Bea froze. "What do you mean?" Lorenzo's expression turned lethal. "I intercepted an encrypted text file from Grigori Yudin's lieutenant in Brighton Beach. It's written in a localized coded dialect of Russian underworld slang. My other guys couldn't crack it. I need you to look at it tonight, because I believe I have a rat in my inner circle." For 3 days, Bea barely slept. She sat at the massive marble island in the penthouse kitchen, surrounded by empty coffee cups, highlighters, and printouts of the intercepted Russian texts. The code was brilliant, utilizing phonetic spelling of Cyrillic mixed with localized Brooklyn street slang. But it wasn't a match for a woman who had spent 5 years deconstructing morphological typologies. On Thursday morning at 3 a.m., the pieces clicked into place. Bea gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She grabbed the papers, her thick thighs chafing as she ran down the long hallway toward Lorenzo's private suite. She didn't bother knocking. She burst through the heavy oak doors. Lorenzo was awake, sitting in a leather armchair by the window, cleaning a Heckler & Koch USP compact pistol. He wore only dark sweatpants, his heavily tattooed chest bare in the moonlight. He looked up, instantly alert. "It's Vincent." Bea breathed, her chest heaving as she waved the papers. "Your underboss, Vincent." Lorenzo went deadly still. "Explain." "The texts," Bea said, walking over and slapping the papers onto the glass side table. "They aren't just schedules. They are using a specific syntactic structure, a verbal tick. The writer constantly uses the phrase "Vykontse kontsov" at the end of the day, but places it at the beginning of the sentence. It's grammatically incorrect in Russian, but it's a direct translation of an English idiom. Vincent says that all the time. "At the end of the day, boss." He's the one giving Grigori your shipment schedules. And Lorenzo, she pointed a shaking, plump finger at the final highlighted line. He gave Grigori the security codes to the Red Hook warehouse. The shipment coming in tonight. It's an ambush. Lorenzo stood up. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The raw, unfiltered violence in his eyes was terrifying, but for the first time, none of it was directed at her. "Get dressed," Lorenzo commanded, chambering a round into his pistol. "Dark clothes, flat shoes." "Me, why do I have to go to a mafia shootout?" Bea squeaked, her panic returning full force. "Because if Grigori's men are there, they will be using scrambled radio frequencies. I need ears on their comms. And Beatrice..." He stepped close, cupping her soft, round face in his rough hands. "I am not letting you out of my sight. Ever again." 2 hours later, the air inside the Red Hook warehouse was thick with the smell of saltwater motor oil and impending death. Lorenzo and his men, heavily armed and cloaked in shadows, had infiltrated the catwalks above the main floor. Down below, millions of dollars in untraceable weaponry were packed into wooden crates. Bea was pressed flat against a steel girder on the catwalk, a bulky tactical headset clamped over her ears, a tablet in her lap. She was terrified, sweating profusely through her dark sweater, but her mind was laser-focused. Below them, the massive cargo doors groaned open. Black SUVs rolled in. Grigori's heavily armed Bratva foot soldiers poured out, sweeping the room. Among them, looking nervous and sweating, was Vincent. Lorenzo raised his hand, signaling his snipers to wait. He looked at Bea. Bea pressed the earpiece tighter. She could hear the Russian tactical chatter bleeding through the decrypted frequency. "Sector Alpha clear, awaiting the Italian target." A voice crackled in Russian. "They're setting up a kill box near the east exits," Bea whispered to Lorenzo, her voice barely a breath. 12 men, heavy armor. Lorenzo nodded, his jaw tight. He raised his rifle. Suddenly, a massive spotlight flared on from a crane above them, washing the catwalk in blinding white light. One of Grigori's men had spotted a reflection off a sniper's scope. "Na balkon ogon." On the balcony fire. A Russian commander screamed. The warehouse erupted into deafening chaos. Bullets tore through the steel grating, pinging dangerously close to Bea's head. She screamed, dropping flat on her stomach, her large body seeking any cover the metal beam could provide. Lorenzo's men returned fire. The noise was apocalyptic. Wood-splintered glass shattered, and the smell of cordite burned Bea's throat. Through the chaos, Bea heard the Russian radio chatter escalate into a frantic scream. The commander was calling for reinforcements to flank Lorenzo's position via the north stairwell. If they made it up those stairs, Lorenzo and his men would be trapped. Panic seized Bea, but it was quickly replaced by a desperate, ferocious instinct to survive. She looked at the heavy two-way radio Lorenzo had left by her tablet, the one synced to the Russian frequency. Bea snatched the radio. She hit the transmission button. She didn't just speak Russian. She summoned the deepest, most guttural, authoritative Moscow dialect bark she could muster, mimicking the cadence of Grigori's elite guard. "Otmana, Otmana!" Bea screamed into the radio. "Abort, abort! Zasada na severnoi! Lesnitse vse odkodiat, ka yuzhnim vorotam, nemedleno." Ambush on the north stairwell. All units fall back to the south gates. Immediately down on the floor, the Russian tactical team hesitated. The commanding voice on their encrypted channel was absolute. Believing they were walking into a trap, the squad that was about to flank Lorenzo abruptly turned and sprinted toward the south exit. "They're falling back to the south gates," Bea yelled to Lorenzo over the gunfire. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He signaled his heavy gunners. As the clustered Russian squad funneled toward the south exit, Lorenzo's men unleashed a devastating crossfire, effectively neutralizing Grigori's elite strike force in seconds. Silence fell over the warehouse, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the hiss of a punctured steam pipe. Down on the floor, Vincent was on his knees, weeping a gun held to the back of his head by one of Lorenzo's men. Grigori was nowhere to be seen. He had likely sent his men to do the dirty work. Lorenzo lowered his rifle. He was covered in drywall dust, a shallow, bloody graze across his cheekbone. He walked over to where Bee was slowly pushing herself up from the metal, grating her knees, trembling violently. She looked up at him, her wide brown eyes filled with tears, her hair a wild, frizzy mess, her clothes covered in dirt. Lorenzo dropped his rifle. It clattered loudly against the steel. He fell to his knees in front of her, his hands gripping her thick waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "You magnificent, brilliant woman." Lorenzo breathed his voice, thick with an emotion Bea had never heard from him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent over the gunpowder. "You just saved my life. Again. I think I need to stress-eat a very large pizza." Bea sobbed, wrapping her plump arms around his broad, muscular shoulders, burying her face in his chest. Lorenzo pulled back his dark eyes, burning with fierce, uncompromising possession. He framed her soft face with his calloused, blood-stained hands. "You can have whatever you want, Beatrice. The whole city is yours. Because from this night forward, you are no longer just my translator." He leaned in, capturing her lips in a bruising, desperate, hungry kiss that tasted of danger and absolute devotion. "You are my consigliere," he whispered against her mouth. "You are my queen." Who knew that a late delivery of hot pastrami would lead to the rise of the most powerful, brilliant, and beautifully thick mafia queen New York has ever seen? Bea proved that true power isn't about fitting into a sample size. It's about owning the room in 5 different languages. If you loved this intense, twist-filled mafia romance, smash that like button, share the story with your fellow romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories every week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Bea's shoes?